So about a year ago, the program committee was discussing programs, and we sometimes just, range really wide. And we were thinking about different kinds of programs. And we were thinking how most of our programs have been more like natural history, biology, geology, mostly biology and natural history, but not too many of them, if any, have focused really on the creative response to nature, like art or poetry or whatever, writing, music, whatever. We haven't really done any of those. And so we were kind of brainstorming what we could do that would be sort of a creative, examining creative responses to nature. And so we were thinking about poetry or poetic nature writing, which is more what Tom Gardner does. Tom Gardner has been in the English department at Virginia Tech for about 40 years. And your main field is, what would you say?
Oh, American poetry.
American poetry. Okay, so it is mostly poetry. And about, I don't know, 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, I took part in a class that he led where the people in the group examined poetry. And the discussion was just so interesting and lively. And I really appreciated the way that Tom led it. And so he came to mind and we were talking about having this topic. So Tom lives on the edge of the Jefferson National Forest and he runs there. And at least one of the two books that we will look at tonight, books that he's written, creative books about nature. One is called Poverty Creek Journal. That's the one that looks at his experience when he's running along Poverty Creek, Jefferson National Forest. And the other one is called Sundays. And he's written books about poetry and thinking, and these two creative books. And they've lived, as I said, in Blacksburg for 40 years. So we welcome Tom Gardner. I'm standing out of the picture. Sorry. Welcome Tom Gardner to do our program tonight. I think we'll have some discussion at the end.
I need to switch it over here.
Hear me? Okay.
I think.
Now can you hear me? Good. Okay,
sorry
terrific. Could somebody near the front pass these out? Would you mind? Thank you very much. Great. The world is a whole lot more complicated than it used to be. Okay, good. So you guys can hear me in the back, and I'm hoping people can hear me on the screen. So thank you all for having me. I think what Sarah said.
Sorry, just you can keep talking. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think Sarah hit pretty much everything that you need to know. I've been here for 40 years. I teach courses in poetry, mostly. Poetry for me lately has shifted from just things in lines and rhyme to paragraphs and novels and film and things like that. I'm going to talk about a couple of books that I've written. One is focused on running every day on the Poverty Creek Trail off of Pendapas Pond, and the other is not running, but sort of walking on a lot of local trails. So Sarah thought it was at least close to the same landscape that you guys are interested in. So we'll see if we have some kind of common ground. And the idea that I wanted to try to cover was thinking with you a little bit about writing creatively about the natural world. So the kind of writing that I'm drawn to is writing that's incredibly sort of precise and accurate about the natural world, which of course probably are the kind of talks that you hear and the kind of work that you do, but also writing that moves from those sort of accurate sort of descriptions and handling the textures of the world out into other things, out into memory, out into reflection, out into speculation. So if that makes sense. So I'm interested in kind of two things at once. And there's a whole sort of tradition of that. Oh, if I stand this far back, you can actually see me on the computer. There's a whole tradition of that sort of writing that I teach sometimes and that I read all the time. So the sort of the leading figure in all of that is Thoreau. So that's the quotation on the board. It might be on the computer, I'm not sure, and it's in the handout that I gave you. So I thought I'd just look at that for you a little bit. You might even know it. So Thoreau's Walden is the sort of the famous creative book about nature. Everybody probably read it in high school, and boy, if we're lucky, you've touched it 2 or 3 times since then. Thoreau spent 2 years on Walden Pond. He compressed it to 1 year in the book. The book has a little bit to do with how to build a cabin and how to farm, make a garden with beans and that sort of thing, and how to do it kind of cheaply. But mostly what the book is, it's a series of metaphoric speculations about the natural world. So it's really, for me, a book of meditations, sort of a book about doing emotional and spiritual work using the natural world. So when I teach it, I sort of teach those spots. So the paragraph that I gave you is kind of a sort of a simple way of getting at his theory. So I thought I would read it to you, maybe part by part. And if 1 or 2 of you want to say a few things, that would be great. And then we'll flip the page over and I'll do a similar thing with a paragraph from Annie Dillard, one of my favorite writers. I'll catch my breath for a second and then read some of my own work. And I would be glad to take a lot of questions if you have them at that point. So here's Thoreau. He begins this way. Sometimes after staying in a village parlor till the family had all retired, I have returned to the woods and partly with a view to the next day's dinner, spent the hours of midnight fishing from a boat by moonlight, serenaded by owls and foxes. We were just talking about that, and hearing from time to time the creaking note of some unknown bird close at hand. Okay, so that's the beginning. And sort of the funny thing that you have to think about a little bit is Thoreau's cabin was really near Concord. Thoreau used to go in and do his laundry. He used to go in and eat, not every night, but sometimes with friends. So this is about returning to his cabin after being with friends, right? And he comes back and it's night and he's going to go fishing sometime in the hours after midnight, maybe to get his dinner for the next day. So that's the start. And then here's his long, sort of beautiful sentence. And if somebody can sort of help us sort of visualize this, I'll stop and let you try. These experiences were very memorable and valuable to me, anchored in 40 feet of water and 20 or 30 rods from the shore, surrounded sometimes by thousands of small perch and shiners, dimpling the surface with their tails in the moonlight, and communicating by a long flaxen line with mysterious nocturnal fishes, which had their dwelling 40 feet below, or sometimes dragging 60 feet of line about the pond as I drifted in the gentle night breeze, now and then feeling a slight vibration along it, indicative of some life prowling about its extremity, of dull, uncertain, blundering purpose there, and slow to make up its mind. At length you slowly raise, pulling hand over hand, some horned pout squeaking and squirming to the upper air. Okay, so that's not the kind of sentence that I much allow my students to write, but it's really a beautiful one. Did anybody catch the drift of what he was talking about? Fishing midnight, what did he do? Yeah, so if you can't hear it on the computer, he's watching his fishing line, but it's actually midnight, so he's not watching it with his eyes. He's watching it with what? With his hands. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting, isn't it? So he's either anchored, and he says, holding the line, he's communicating with what's down below in the dark, or he's drifting and he's feeling the vibration of the line in his hand. Do you see that? So he's out there drifting in the dark, using his hand, using the line to touch something that he can't see. And then every once in a while, the line will jerk, the vibrations will be felt in his hand, and it'll pull up what he calls some horned pout squeaking and squirming. Okay, so exactly right. Please.
Except for there's moonlight.
Yeah, there is moonlight. So maybe, yeah. But give me the hand anyway, right? I think he's doing it with his hand. Yeah, you're right. There is moonlight. Good. So that's the picture. And then he says this, it was very queer, especially in dark nights, when your thoughts had wandered to vast and cosmogonal themes. We would say cosmic nowadays, those of us who grew up, when we grew up, vast and cosmic themes in other spheres, to feel this faint jerk, which came to interrupt your dreams and link you to nature again. So he's out there in the dark, in the moonlight, feeling the line, almost dreaming. Do you see that? And then he feels a jerk and he's linked to nature again. Okay, and then this great last sentence. It seemed as if I might next cast my line upward into the air, as well as downward into this element, which was scarcely more dense, right? So he's fishing downward, but as he dreams, he's also fishing upward. Do you see that? No, he doesn't mean that literally. He's fishing in dreams. He's fishing in speculation. He's fishing in memory. He's fishing in, since it was Thoreau, some sort of transcendental idea, right? But he's doing two things at once. He's touching the natural world through the vibration, right? Part of the natural world that he can't even quite make out because it's so far down, but he's also touching a spiritual, emotional, speculative world. Was that your hand? No, okay, sorry, too much teaching. And then he says, thus I caught two fishes, as it were, with one hook. And do you see the sort of play that he's doing there? He's catching one literal fish, and he's catching another fish that you call the fish of idea, or the fish of spirit, or the fish of speculation. Well, that's the kind of writing that I'm really interested in, and that I do and that I teach pretty often. Stuff that catches one fish that's very precise about trails and light and clouds and lakes and surfaces and fish and that sort of thing. It's as precise as you can be, but also at the same time is using that to think about larger or other sorts of issues, sometimes emotional, sometimes spiritual, sometimes political, sometimes personal, hardly matters what, but in this tradition, you're sort of catching two fish at once. Sarah, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just realized I have an image that doesn't actually describe any words. I picture a light sparkling all over the water, fish jumping, and then he doesn't say that's either, but then I picture the stars. The kind of double image of the lights in the sky and the lights in the water.
Oh.
He doesn't actually say, but that's the image that pulls up in my mind.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So actually, you two were making similar kind of comments that with the moonlight out there, the light on the surface is making the pond in a way dance, so he can see all those fish. And it's as if, but he didn't write it down, he had connected the dancing surface and the dancing fish on the surface to the stars. And he does that later in Walden a couple of different times. And that maybe led him to make the down deep connection and the up high connection. Yeah.
I realized he read it again. He doesn't say
Yeah.
anything about the stars. He just uses words cosmogonal and
Yeah.
spheres, and I'm just thinking.
Yeah, so maybe that's right. Maybe those fish on the surface brought him there. Okay, so does that make sense? That's what I mean by doing two things at once. And then the Annie Dillard quote. I'll keep on talking a little bit. So if you're here, just flip your paper over. Oh, thank you. Yeah, you got it. So Annie Dillard is the author of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. How many people here know that book? it's like, yeah, I'm sure almost everybody, it's one of the great books in this tradition. It was written, I think, in 1974 or so. When I started here at Tech in 1982, I got this offer. I was doing my grad school work in Wisconsin, and I got this offer from Virginia Tech. I looked at the map, and the first thing I thought was, oh, this is near Tinker Creek. It was my favorite book. And I thought Annie Dillard and I were going to be neighbors, and we were going to hang out and all that sort of thing. So I've seen Tinker Creek and I've seen Tinker Cliffs, but I've only seen Annie Dillard sort of in talks and things like that. I haven't hung out with her, but it's one of these great books. Here's a paragraph. It's actually 3 or 4 paragraphs that I blended together from a later book called Wholly the Firm. You may not know it. It's a really wildly speculative kind of book, and it has a kind of graphic image in the middle of it, but it so much describes the tradition that I'm interested in. I thought I would read it to you. So let me try this. She's talking in the book about a camping trip that she took years before this book along the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, so in our country. One night, a moth flew into the candle, was caught, burned dry, and held. Okay, so she's out reading by a candlelight, I think, and then a moth shows up and is fried. I must have been staring at the candle, or maybe I looked up when a shadow crossed my page. At any rate, I saw it all. A golden female moth, a biggish one with a 2-inch wingspan, flapped into the fire, dropped her abdomen into the wet wax, stuck, flame, frazzled, and fried in a second. Really different sound from Thoreau, isn't it? Did you hear that? Very kind of jazzy, lively, all that. Her moving wings ignited like tissue paper, enlarging the circle of light in the clearing and creating out of darkness the sudden blue sleeves of my sweater, the green leaves of jewelweed by my side, the ragged red trunk of a pine, right? So the moth flies into the flame of the candle, flares up. She can suddenly see her sweater. She can suddenly see the jewelweed around her. At once the light contracted again, right? The moth burns, and the moth's wings vanished in a fine, foul smoke. At the same time, her 6 legs clawed, curled, blackened, and ceased, disappearing utterly, and her head jerked in spasms, making a sputtering sound. Her antenna crisped and burned away, and her heaving mouth parts crackled like pistol fire. When it was all over, her head was, so far as I could determine, gone the long way of her wings and legs. Okay, that's the graphic part. So the moth loses its wings, it loses its antenna, it loses its head, just instantaneously almost. Okay, and then she says a few other things, and then here's the part that I care about. All that was left was the glowing horn shell of her abdomen and thorax, a fraying, partially collapsed gold tube jammed upright in the candle's round pool. Okay, so can you visualize that, right? When the moth flew into the candle, it got jammed into the wax, right? With its, and it got jammed into the wax. Everything burns away except for the tube, the abdomen of it jammed into the wax. Can you all see that? Can somebody nod? Okay, good, perfect. Can you nod on the computer? Good. All that was left was the glowing shell. The wax rose in the moth's body from her soaking abdomen to her thorax, to the jagged hole where her head should be, and widened into flame, a saffron yellow flame that robed her to the ground like any immolating monk. She's probably thinking of that famous Vietnam picture there. But so do you see that? The tube of the abdomen in the wax, and then as the wax melts, it's drawn up through the tube, and then it flares at the top of the tube of the abdomen. Does that make sense to you? Can you visualize that? So there are actually 2 flames. The candle had 2 wicks, 2 flames of identical height, side by side. The moth's head was fire, where the moth would be, right? My head, take my head off and put a flame in it. The moth's head was fire. She burned for 2 hours till I blew her out. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you get that. So there's the moth stuck in the wax. There's the wax rising through the moth's body, and then there's this flame, like a candle flame, where the head would be. And then she does something just beautiful with this. She makes a kind of metaphor. A nun lives in the fires of the spirit, that would be the head. A thinker lives in the bright wick of the mind, right? That would be the body of the moth. An artist lives jammed in the pool of materials. So she breaks it into three parts. An artist touches the materials. A thinker handles the materials, the wax, right, with the tube of the mind, the imagination, all that sort of stuff. And the result of that is fire. It's thought, it's praise, it's speculation, it's lament, it's grief, it's all those sort of more emotional, spiritual things. Now, what's cool about the book is that she acts as if these are different, as if what the nun does up on top is different from what the thinker does in the middle, is different from what the artist does jammed into particulars. But I'm absolutely convinced that in this book, and in the best writing in this tradition, artists do those three things, creative people about the natural world do those three things at once. Did you see that in my writing and Thoreau's writing and the writing of people that I'm drawn to, Annie Dillard, you're jammed into the particulars of the world, right? What an owl's cry sounds like, what it looks like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You're jammed into the world. You handle the particulars of the world through this tube called thought, right? You look at it this way, you look at it this way, you compare it to other things, you handle its textures, and the end result of that is something emotional, something spiritual, something beautiful, something creative that you would call the flame of the spirit. So does that make sense? Thoreau says it's kind of two parts, right? You fish and you catch two fish on one hook. One is called the materials of the world, and the other is called that sort of speculative thought. Annie Dillard kind of refines them a little bit and says, well, maybe that, but maybe let's call it three. In the wax of the world, through the tube of the mind, issuing into these sort of speculative, spiritual kind of things. But it's the same sort of thing. So the writing that I'm kind of encouraging you to think about and to read and really to practice, if you're interested, would try to do something like that. These two things, to be in the world, but to lift the world up into thinking, then into song, into poetry, into speculation, into memory, into grief, into all those kind of things. There's a whole tradition of that kind of writing. So I gave you some names at the bottom. This is number 3. And really, I could have given you 20. When I originally did this, I was trying to fit it all on one side of the page. And then Barb told me that's not really the wisest thing to do. She didn't say that, but she meant that. So I still left just the short. But there's some recent books and some books that go back a little bit further. So let me stop there just for a second. And then I'm going to read a little bit from my own 2 books, and then I would be glad to have reactions to that. But are there questions or things that you noticed that I didn't really talk about? Pardon? Yeah, and Sarah is watching the chat. So if you had a thing you wanted to mention now, we could, or we can wait till later when I have more time for questions. But anybody? Okay, well, you're easy to live with. So I'm going to read, I'm trying to watch the clock. I'm going to read maybe 3 sections from this book. Maybe you can see it on the computer. It's called Poverty Creek Journal. The book came out in 2014. It's based on my running journals from 2012. I run on the Poverty Creek trails every morning. We live on the top of Brush Mountain, and I just go down to the upper lot, and I've probably seen some of you out there on the trails, I bet. So I'm there most mornings from 7 till about 8 or 8:30. And I keep little tiny journals, or I keep journals with little tiny sort of entries about the weather and how far I ran and you know, maybe how fast or something like that. But in 2012, I decided to put a little more energy into my journals. So I would come back sort of drippy and sweaty and sit down in a notebook and record not just what I just said, the distance and the time and all that, but a couple of thoughts, things that I was thinking about when I was running, because I'd always wanted to write about running. And they were thoughts about sort of the body and the body's connection to the natural world, but a lot of memories that came to me. I was interested in how a thing that I saw took me to my childhood, took me to something I was teaching, took me to something with my children, all that sort of thing. So it took me to my reading. So I tried to capture some of that in my journal notes. And then as the year went on, I took maybe the best journal note each week and turned it into a long page length paragraph, kind of a prose poem, we would call it. The fancy term nowadays is lyric essay, but just a piece of prose, kind of like the two that I just saw. So I ended up with 52 entries over the year 2012, starting from January and ending at the end of December, the next January. The other thing that was really interesting to me about all that, interesting and tragic and meaningful all at the same time, is my brother John died suddenly of a heart attack that year in late February. He was only 58. So I think it was the most fortunate thing ever to be writing a book dealing with that grief. The writing gave me a way of just thinking it through, remembering him, and he was a good runner, he was better than me, all that kind of stuff. So it really gave me a chance as the year went on to kind of think through what it meant to lose somebody who was that close. We were only 18 months apart. We were, slept in the same bed for a decade, all that kind of stuff. So it was really quite a shock for me. So the book is about the Poverty Creek Trail. The book is about my running. The book is about him. But I think the book is maybe more than anything else, just about attention, about trying to capture two fish with one hook, right? Or trying to lift that Poverty Creek Trail up through my mind, through my memory, into something like spirit. So maybe I'll just read 3 entries from this. So they're dated. This is October 5th, 2012. So it's number 41. So it's pretty far into the year. So there's a little bit of my brother that comes in towards the end. But it's October 5th, and it was kind of October 5th in 2012 was kind of like October 15 or 20 this year. Remember how yellow it was? It's all gone now, but there was about 10 days, those trails in particular were just blindingly yellow. And this is the day I was thinking about. October 5th, 2012. 8 miles in the afternoon. So that's the running part of it. 8 miles in the afternoon. Leaves down, underfoot, shimmering in the air like flashes of thought. 2 of them, yellow, dangle over the trail, turning at the end of threads. Humidity low, air clear as glass. One of the reasons you slog through the summer is to be in shape when a day like this appears. A day when you can step away from your body and take the body in. This gliding presence no longer yours, though once you think it might have been. John Ames in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead talks about the Sabbath this way, a fragment of time set apart so its holiness can be perceived. Stepping back from time and taking it in, time which unattended snags and knots and runs through your hands. Do you remember time? Set this far apart, can you make it out, panel after panel, spinning in the light? So maybe I'll just talk you through this one. I won't do it every time, but so it begins with the 8-mile run in the afternoon. And then it moves to the particulars of the world. What I noticed, that the leaves were down, that they were shimmering in the air like flashes of thought, I said, right? So they're falling down. Some of them are caught in spider webs and they're dangling. You've seen that on the trails, I'm sure. They're dangling at the end of threads, and the air was absolutely clear. The humidity was low. And I love the fall. I mean, I love running in the fall. And the reason I run hard in the summer is so I can be in shape in the fall, right? And when you're in shape, not so much anymore with this body, but when you're in shape, you can do something like this, an 8-mile run, without even thinking about running, if that makes any sense to you. You just sort of move and think as if you have no body. So that's what happened to me. I was thinking of the leaves and the clearness of the air. And then I was thinking about what it felt like to almost have no body, to run and step away from your body. So a couple of you are nodding, you know what I mean by that. And then my mind, the tube and Annie Dillard connected stepping away from your body to what the novelist Marilyn Robinson called the Sabbath, right? Why is Sunday important? Because you step away from the world of time in order to look at the world of time. Okay, that's a pretty fancy idea, but right, I was stepping away from my body when I was running in order to look at my body. Marilyn Robinson says on Sunday, or on the day of rest, you step away from time in order to admire time, in order to see why it's holy, in order to see why it's sacred. I was seeing why the body was holy, why the body was sacred, why that trail was holy, why it was sacred, by stepping away from it, even as I was in the middle of it. And then at the end, this was hard to catch, but at the end, I then addressed my brother, right? Which was weird to do, but it's what came to me, to wonder sort of where he is and where in relationship to time he is, even as I'm caught in the middle of it. So I don't know how much of that conveyed when you first read it. This stuff is pretty dense. They're like poems, but that's what I mean by catching two fish at once, or doing the wax, the tube, the flame, right? It sort of came as I was meditating on the clearness of the air. Okay, let me try another one. This is December 21st. So this is number 51. It's almost at the end of the book, on the same trail. Dusting of snow, rhododendron leaves full again, snow settling on each leaf. There was another entry where I was thinking about the rhododendron leaves when it gets cold. You've seen it, haven't you? And they sort of curl up like cigars, kind of, but it had there was almost a thaw in December, so they were full again, and then there was snow on each leaf. At about 2.5 miles, the woods open up, and you could see animal trails crossing the slopes, visible in the snow. They look like contour lines. The trail bends sharply and plunges back down to the creek through the now invisible lines, snow on the tops of my legs. Elizabeth Bishop, another one of my writers, describes staring too long at illustrations in a family Bible, her tired eyes dropping and the engraved lines moving apart, something between the lines calling her down, tears spilling, the blurry page igniting in, quote, watery, prismatic white and blue. The wind picks up and I'm blinking back tears. There's a story you like to tell about a run so cold the sweat froze in the corner of your eyes. And I'd counter with a story about my friend driving home with his head out the window so he could show his wife the 2-inch icicle hanging from his ear. Oh, good, you laughed. My students look at me like, what? This was before cell phones, right? So he couldn't take a picture of it. He had to leave the window open so the icicle would stay there. Mostly true, though I wouldn't stare too long at either. A tree cracks and falls in 2 stages, then quiet. It helps to imagine you, this is my brother again, reading these lines. Don't worry about the details. The good stuff, though, it's all for you. So just to do it quickly, so it starts with the scene with the ice on a rhododendron, with the snow on the rhododendron leaves. And then as I'm running and I'm on top of a hill, I notice animal trails that when you first get snow, you can pick out the trails. Do you know what I mean by that? They're invisible most of the time, but that first snow kind of gives you those trails. And then I compared them to contour lines on a map. That gave me this great Elizabeth Bishop poem in which she's staring at an old family Bible with engravings of, whatever, the Last Supper or things like that. And she's staring at the engravings so hard that her eyes start to blur, right? She can't focus and her eyes start to water and then they start to burn. Then I come back to me running and my eyes watering because of the cold. And then the various sort of stories that my brother and I would make up, the lies we would tell about our great running exploits. And those lines of the stories are like the lines of the engravings, or like the lines of the contours. And all of those lines we're falling through. Do you see that? Into tears, into flame, into memory, into longing, into missing him, all of that kind of stuff, right? So it's just a series of associations that I made from a quite literal thing: snow on the rhododendron leaves, snow on the animal trails, and then my mind just associated a thing and a thing and a thing. And it became a poem about, or a paragraph about, grief. And then the last one in the book, it's December 30th. And I wonder if this is going to ring a bell with a bell is actually a pun that I didn't mean, with people here. You'll see in a second. So December 30th, Sunday morning, 23 degrees, both ponds frozen and glassy. So the Pandapus ponds, the upper pond and the lower pond, 6 miles, about an inch of ice on the trail, frozen snow melt, frozen slush, but I managed to stay upright, right? So at my age, you shouldn't be doing this, but right, there was ice, but there was enough texture that I could run. Spent the run thinking about texture. Much of the ice hollowed out from below, or mixed with leaves, or raised up in welts, with just enough give for me to run at a decent pace, thinking with my feet. Does that make sense? You can't really use your brain, you have to use your body. So my feet were picking out a way to run. Some patches of glare ice dusted with snow, where I picked my way lightly or slide by in the leaves on the side. So a lot of the trail was icy but textured. I was okay. But when you hit glare ice, you're in trouble. So you have to get off in the leaves or be careful. What Wittgenstein, a philosopher that I care about, wanted from philosophy in the second half of his career was a way to stay upright. We have got onto slippery ice where there is no friction, he said, turning his gaze away from perfection and trying to make out how people actually move and think and make connections. Time after time, he'd think himself into a corner, and time after time, he'd walk himself out, trying to sense for himself the texture of words. Okay, again, that's pretty dense, but I went from the texture of the ice and my body thinking to this philosopher who was thinking about the texture of language, essentially. And he's saying that most philosophers try to make language so pure that you can't get any traction, right? It's so abstract that you just slip and you can't get the world in. So he was looking for language that was precise, that was particular, that was gnarly, that was slangy, what language that we normally do our business. He wanted that to get out of the problems that philosophy had thought itself into. So what I was doing with my body, he was doing with language. So time after time, he'd think himself through the texture of words. And then I conclude with this: it's the dailiness of these runs I like. Small red Christmas bells scattered today through the woods, hanging at turns and intersections, marking off someone's thought. The sun at the end blinding off the pond again, gone by the time I worked down to its level, blocked by the mountain and the coming in clouds. So I don't know if anyone noticed that, but in 2012, on Christmas Day, somebody hung little red balls all along the trails. Some of you are nodding, at many of the intersections, and I think sometimes at random places. My wife have seen those, and I have seen those balls for years. Now, I think somebody is probably adding to them. I'm not really sure, but you can still see a couple of them. I mean, I could tell you where they are, and some of you are not. So I was connecting the marking off of those intersections with the red balls to texturing the trail. Do you see? To texturing words for Wittgenstein, or texturing the ice when I was running, that by marking those particular things in the world, we can do our work. We can think about grief, we can think about meaning, we can think about family, all that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the running book. And then I'll take maybe just 5 or 10 minutes on the more recent one. Pardon? Oh, thank you. Yeah, I saw you do that. I appreciate it. As long as people can hear me, I'll just keep groaning away. So this is the second book that's kind of similar. Let me see if I can get on the computer. Yeah, it's called Sundays, and I loved writing these paragraphs, but I knew I couldn't keep writing about running. I had to do something else. So I decided in 2016 and 17 to try to write every Sunday for 52 Sundays in a row. And Sunday, I don't normally run. My wife and I walk or something like that. So I took running out of out of what I could fall back on. So it was just bodies and trails and clouds and all that sort of thing. So it was really interesting to me. I really loved doing it. It got kind of intense towards the end because it meant every Sunday I had to find something to write about. So sometimes at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, I was really sort of stretching, trying to make it. But then the book kind of got a momentum of its own, and I think it worked out pretty well. So a lot of these same trails, a lot of the same references to writers, but not so much memories of running. So maybe 3 of these, and then we can do some questions if you have them. So this is number 34. It's April 16th. So that's the date we know. April 16, Easter, the shootings at Virginia Tech 10 years ago today. Okay, so just like I did with the running journals, but now I was trying to locate it. So this is an Easter, this is an April 16th, 10 years past the shootings. We've driven partway up Johns Mountain to where the Appalachian Trail crosses it, and then hiked north to Kelly Knob, a steep half-mile, and then easier going along the ridge. So surely many of you know that hike, right? And how steep it is for the first half-mile. A hawk over us at the knob, the hills around campus in the hazy distance, improvised fireplace behind us, leafless trees below, virtually no green up here at all, in fact, the barest of stage sets, right? So it's the hike up to Kelly Knob, get up to the top, and it seemed to me, this is mid-April, right? That high up, hardly anything was green, it seemed to me, everything was bare. The fireplace was, dirty and ragged and all that. It seemed like a bare kind of landscape, the barest of stage sets. We imagined being here at night, the wind whipping, trying to get a fix on distant flickering lights. It's as if we are drifting on a thermal 10 years in the making and don't have the eyes to make out anything below us, though surely something in the wind had called out to us as it swept us up to this height. Okay, I tried to do a whole lot of work there, but I went from the hawk riding the thermal to the 10 years past the shooting to not being able to make sense of the landscape. And I said something like, my wife and I seem to have been floating on this thermal for 10 years, that we still hadn't quite seen our way all the way back to the campus, to the shootings, to that trauma, if that makes sense, right? It was every April 16th, it still seems not fully processed. It's as if we're drifting on the thermal, don't have the eyes to make out. There's nothing to say. What's down there seems as settled and fixed as these worn away hills. So that's a kind of sad poem so far. A through hiker passes behind us, pauses, and then exits stage left. So you've all had that experience, right? I mean, he kind of nodded, but he didn't really care about us. We go too, though we turn away from him and make our way back down the way we came. And then, I'm not sure who saw it first, but as we picked our way down the trail and then the rest of the way down to the valley, the green came back. And not only green, but redbud, dogwood, cherry, newly opened fields and calves alongside mothers. So, I mean, it was just coming down the elevation, but on the way up, we hadn't bothered, we hadn't noticed. We get up to the top and to the dead sort of, kind of lost emotion, needing some sort of life. Then as we go down, it all comes rushing back, right? The green pops out, the red bud pops out, the cherry, all that sort of stuff. It was as if a blind had shifted, as if the mountain itself had split open along one side, and the invisible world all of this was resting upon had risen up to meet us. Now I can't drive slowly enough. None of this is settled. Everything is unfolding and opening up from within, some tucked away stream, carving away at us under a just about to crumble bank, right? So it's not just that the natural world is bursting open suddenly, but we're kind of bursting open, or the world itself, right, that had seemed just rock and dead is now filled with life, with spirit, with, you know, making sense out of that thing from 10 years ago, all of that. Okay, I'm going a little fast, but you can get the rhythm of the thinking, I think.
Very Easter as well, like Easter with the death and the rebirth.
Beautiful, of course. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think, and to put Easter in the first or second set of words was kind of like you're noticing the shining of the moonlight. It surely gave it to me without me knowing it was there. I mean, I don't think I was consciously writing an Easter poem because that would have seemed too cheesy. But Easter in my fingers or hands as I wrote those notes came back that way. That's beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to have you in class. So I'm going to try to just do two more. Okay, so this is June 11, pretty late in the book. This is the Cascade Trail. So this is the falls at Cascades. We're halfway up the wall above the falls and stop for a last look. So, you know, when you're at the falls, there's the wall now that they've built sort of a rock sort of set of stairway. So it's a legal place that we're in. We're not, we're not doing that. We're halfway up the wall above the falls and stop for a last look. Water droplets in the air, the sun lifting everything up into itself. We're with old friends we haven't seen in 20 years, and we're a little lost. All of us trying too hard to make something out of the chain of events that had suddenly brought us together. So we had visitors from Finland, it turned out, where we lived for a while. We hadn't seen them for 20 years. We took them on our favorite hike, and it was incredibly awkward, as it would be after 20 years, I guess. We were trying too hard. We were trying to make them fall in love with Virginia the way we had with Finland. So let me go on. This is our woods, our favorite trail up to the falls, but we've been acting like tour guides. The slope Hugo had torn through and clear cut a decade ago, the new walkway placed after a terrible spring flood, tiny butterflies that look like violets. It's as if a storm had touched down once and then moved on, leaving only well-meaning behind, right? That's the awkwardness, right? We couldn't get it. We can't get the rhythm right. And then there's a pause. A father drowned in the pool below us last year. So now I'm back to the scene when he went in after his son, who had gotten caught up in the fall's currents, I say, and I'm sure you remember that. It was near the rock, that rock ledge. You could see how it could have happened, but it still doesn't make sense. Not in these rising columns of light and mist, the echoing shouts of other men's children wildly leaping in. Laura has picked up the Finnish lilt in Tula's voice. I can hear them on the switchback above us as they start up again. Tula's sentences stream out of her in long, exuberant plumes of sound, lifting on some inner rise of thought, then plowing to a halt, waiting for Laura to supply the English word. I really worked hard trying to describe that. Tula talks a mile a minute. She has pretty good English, but not great. And she would just flood English words, right? And then just come to a dead stop. And then we would all have to fill in, and then she would start to flood again. They worked almost seamlessly together, Tula and my wife. Veo, that's her husband, is hanging back with me, I realize, so that he doesn't pull too far ahead and separate us again. I'm a really slow walker, even though I run, and he was a really fast walker, and he was trying hard to not separate. Light, shadow, these tiny shifting adjustments, each of us reaching out for the other, plunging under without a thought as to who else might be watching, who might stand ready to follow us in. So I'm thinking about the way we were adjusting our pace, our languages, our familiarity with each other. And then I was thinking about that father adjusting himself to the lost son, and then all of us adjusting ourselves to the fragility of life, both embracing it and knowing how quickly it could be over, all of that kind of stuff. That's the meditation. That's Annie Dillard's sort of flame coming out of the top. Let's see if I can find a short little one. not so short, but it's pretty straightforward. This is July 23rd. This is, turned out that one Sunday we were out in Colorado. So this is a trail in Uray that you might recognize some people. My two brothers-in-law and I are hiking the perimeter trail above Uray, pausing sometimes to figure out our way, our map showing a patchwork of existing trails stitched together to circle the town 700 feet below us. Cascade Cliff to Cascade Falls, Portland Creek to the Ice Park Trail. The names so ordinary, we almost don't take them as applying to these tumbled together foothills and gorges and waterways. At one point, an abandoned water tunnel links trail systems on different sides of a stone face. At another, steps cut by miners a century ago do the trick. We're all limping a bit as we finish. We're all in our 60s. Not Dickinson's precarious gait as she made her way over much vaster bewilderments, but exhausted nonetheless in an everyday sort of way. If you had been one of those three bronzed women who stopped to help us with our map, you wouldn't have noticed. I think that's funny, but nobody ever laughs at that. But these incredibly good hikers came up when these three old guys were bewildered and they just went da da da, and then they took off, and we were clearly invisible to them, right? They just took care of us and kept going. There came a point where what we each thought of ourselves, where what we each thought of ourselves gave way, and a thin gold line, almost visible as it lengthened and contracted in the late afternoon sun, formed between us. This is me and my two brothers-in-law. Somebody slipped, and we all did. Somebody spoke, and for just a second, you couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. Working our way off the trail and back to town, we could make out the whole route we had followed. It seems obvious now, almost logical, and if it weren't for something not quite right in our strides, those awkward links improvised between things might have vanished as well, which would mean ducking our heads or lowering ourselves down steps cut in stone, losing everything that mattered. So we finished the hike, and then you could see how the whole trail went around Uray, that we had really stumbled our way through. And we had to figure out each of the sort of the improvised connections between various trails. And I think maybe the point of this thing, it's pretty near the end of the book, was to say that these improvised connections between things, I want to say between the wax and the brain and the spirit, these improvised connections that each of these entries are making, those are the real thing, right? Not the whole picture, right? Not the sort of stable picture of the world, but those improvised daily connections that we make Sunday after Sunday, or moment after moment, or hike after hike, or child after child, or season after season. All those kind of things are, for me, where you do the really important work. So that's kind of what the book is about. Okay, so let me stop there. It's 7 minutes after 8. So I would be glad to hear remarks or questions or anything like that. And if you want to chat afterwards too, I'd be glad to do that. Please.
I really enjoyed all of your writing and your explanations. Thank you. On your poverty pick journal, when you said you wrote notes after your run,
Right.
did they typically include some of your overarching themes, like the theme for that day? Or was that something that came later?
Oh, that's such a good question. Sure.
How much editing
Yeah.
came into the
Yeah. So normally my journal notes are really short, right? And when I'm not trying to make a book. The year I was trying to make the book, I would normally put the details of the run. And then if I could remember 2 or 3 memories, I would put that in. Thought of my brother, thought of this Elizabeth Bishop poem, felt a connection between my body and the heron or something like that, enough to remind me. And then either later that day or sometimes even 2 or 3 weeks later, I would improvise off of the notes that I would put down. So the actual entries are their art. They pretend in a way to be literally what I was thinking, but they're a kind of a representation of what I was thinking. You'd almost have to have a tape recorder to get it quicker than that. But a lot of the reviews about the book kind of marveled at that one, anybody could run and think at the same time. but you know, once you're in shape, that's not that hard. Then you would think so randomly, they would say, or so intricately, but in fact, that's the case. But it was an arrangement of some literal material, but after the fact, kind of improvised into beauty, I think. Is that probably what it felt like to you too, I would think. Yeah, so thanks for that.
Hey, Tom, the people online are wanting me to unmute my computer, which I cannot do because we get feedback. So I guess you'll need to repeat the question.
Oh, okay.
One person is saying, Beth and Fred are saying, why do you discourage long sentences?
Okay, so the question was why. It was a joke that I had made, right? Why do I discourage long sentences? Yeah, why do I? Because I write long sentences. That's very funny. Yeah, I think in real life, actually, if I had a sentence who wrote a sentence like Thoreau did, I would like hug him or her right for doing that. No, I don't discourage them. But I did find myself as I was reading to you, sometimes feeling like I needed to parse when I'm doing it out loud, those long sentences. So no, I think a long sentence is a long act of thinking, but I think a long act of thinking is sometimes hard to pick up just with your ears. You kind of need your eyes, or you need the chance to sit and read a paragraph a day to think about. So I was mostly laughing at myself for.
Can you mention to the online people the reason why I don't have my mic on?
Yeah, there's a reason Sarah doesn't have her mic on. I don't know if I know. Oh, it's because there was echo in the room.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah.
We can't have two mics on.
Right, yeah. So thank you for prodding Sarah, but she can't respond. I have to do it for her. So anything else?
Yes, somebody says, I purchased several copies of Poverty Creek Journal a few years ago at Runabout Sports and gave them as presents. I read along with you tonight. This is from Maria, is that how you pronounce her? And for my own copy, are these two books available for purchase somewhere currently?
Okay, so if you couldn't hear it online or maybe in the room, somebody who had bought a couple of, this is great, bought a couple of copies of Poverty Creek Journal at Runabout Sports here in, what's it called? First and Main. The running store had bought it and given it to friends for Christmas or something like that. And so the person, she wanted to know if the book and Sundays were still available. So that's perfect. Yes, Runabout Sports carries both books up near the cash register. In my family, I have a bunch of runners, brothers, and it's like a really big deal that the local running store carries my books. They care about that much more than where it was reviewed or anything like that. The running store carries your books. So yeah, you can buy it there. You could obviously buy it on Amazon. The press is called Tupelo Press. And you can Google Poverty Creek Journal or Sundays in my name, and the Tupelo Press site would come up. So you could order it from the press as well. So any of those ways would work. So thank whoever wrote that in for buying the book. Yeah, yeah.
And Bruce would like to see that slide again. And,
Oh,
Karen.
the slide that's up now? Yeah, I can do that.
Anything else?
I thought it was interesting the way you prompted by Sandy's question, which I'm sort of thinking of in another way, how you referred to sort of editing your thoughts, and it was sort of art that, because I'm thinking about how, journaling myself, once I've finished a notebook and I put it away, sometimes I don't even want to go back and read it again. I don't, unless I've got, facts in there just because of calendar kinds of things. It doesn't feel like it has a purpose to me anymore.
So I was taking that and trying to make art out of it. I think that's right.
And that would make such good sense.
Yeah.
Putting it as simply as that.
Yeah. And so sort of what I mean by art are things like connecting a literal detail, right? The snow on the animal trails, connecting that to an emotional detail came for me anyway through a kind of echo, right? Or something that was similar to something else. So the contour lines or the snow on the animal trails was like the contour lines, was like the poem in which the poet looked at lines and then started to cry, was like my brother's tears, right? That's art really that runs through that chain of associations. Normally in a journal, you don't figure all that out, but by sitting slowly over my words, or maybe letting Easter perk through me or something like that, that came. So art is really discovering those connections and then kind of refining them so that it feels for me almost spontaneous. That was your question. This was meant to feel spontaneous, like it was happening when I was running, but it was art. It was crafting the sentences that made it feel like it was happening when I was running. And then I was so thrilled when people would write to me and say, that's what it feels like when I run. I didn't know anybody else felt that. So art took the real thing and focused it so that it felt to somebody like the real thing focused. And then you could hold it in your head. And I don't mean that I'm a great artist. There are great artists, but that's what art does. That's the shift from a journal just for you to something that you want to pass on. So thank you for that. Anything else? Okay.